All right, good morning, everybody, and happy Wednesday. Glad to see you all this morning. This is the third to last lesson before we end for the summer, and that's a great reminder to put all your devices on silent, especially those of you who think it's on silent, but it's actually buried 3 layers in your purse, and it's really loud. It'd be great to silence those. That'd be excellent. As we get started today. We have 2 more weeks after today before we end for the summer. And so, as I said last week, I would love your ideas about what you'd like to study next year. This is the third of a 3-year cycle that we set 3 years ago. And so I haven't asked this question for a few years, but now that we're looking at starting something new next year, what do you want to study? I will say we've received quite a few different ideas. It does seem like the majority of those we've received so far are asking to do something with the prophets. And so be thinking about that. We did a couple Old Testament years, this year's New Testament. See if you want to do, I think I suggested last week, prophets are a good idea. Perhaps there's Joshua, Judges, Ruth. There's also epistles from the New Testament. I mean, there are still plenty of things that we have not done. And so if you think about the progression that we have been through, we've done a couple Gospels, so we probably won't do another Gospel next year. We've done a bit of history. We haven't necessarily done any prophetic literature. Besides, you get a little of that in Daniel, but that's mostly apocalyptic. And then you've got the epistles. So it's prophets, epistles, probably the best ideas to do for next year, but send them in. If you've got comments on the stream, if you're watching live, or if you simply want to send Bub an email, we would love to hear what you have to think and what you'd like to study. As we open with a prayer, just a reminder that you can stream all of these lessons and years past over the summer. If you have RBS withdrawal, then please go back and listen to former lessons. It's good reminders. Let's have a prayer and we'll get started. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, as we are leaning into this Easter season, we ask that you continue to put your hand upon us, fill us with your Spirit, and guide the work that we do and the work that we do to become the people you created us to be, that we can extend your arms of love to all those we meet. I ask your prayers and your presence upon those that we hold in the silence of our hearts and minds, especially those who need your healing touch and those who may be nearing the end of their lives. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we actually had one question in advance of today's lesson, and I thought it would be interesting to just get it out of the way because it's a good question, but it's a question that doesn't have a very clear answer. So we had someone write in to say, if we know the actual date of Jesus' crucifixion, which I thought was actually a bold statement, then why do we continue to tie Easter to the Passover and move that date around? And it's a good question because we anchor some of our dates, like Jesus' birth is always celebrated on December 25th. Okay, great. But we move essentially Holy Week and Easter around every year, that then of course cascades into Pentecost, because Passover and Pentecost, those existed. Those are Jewish holidays, and the Jewish calendar is lunar. And so because the Jewish calendar is lunar, those Jewish holidays that now have a Christian meaning, like Easter or Pentecost, they move around because the Jewish holidays move around. However, this question does get at an interesting idea of date and typology within the Bible that a lot of people try to seek out. And we have talked before about how I want you all to be literate Bible readers, not literal Bible readers, but we're human, and it's human nature to sort of follow the path down. How specific can we actually be about the historic events in the Bible? It's not a bad question to ask because historicity matters. We talked a few years ago when we did Genesis about the idea of the difference between something being historic and something being true. It's a complex, nuanced idea, but there are moments in our Bible that I would say are true that are not historic. They tell a true story, but they're not meant to be literal history, the way that we think of it as kind of modern people. Instead, People just simply wanted to tell good, true stories. However, if we get into a defense, or what we call theologically an apologetics about Jesus, sometimes it's nice to be able to point to at least broad historic strokes of Jesus. Like, for example, was Jesus a real person? Did he actually live? It's very good, I think, to me and to most of us who might wish to defend Christianity, to be able to say we have historic record of Jesus as a real person. Now, I think I told you a few years ago, we do not have that for Moses, but we do have that for Jesus. We have that for the kings like Daniel, David, and others. So Jesus was a real person who lived in the first century. We know Jesus lived in Judea. All of that is historic. So not only is it true, but it's also historic. And the history of that information is good for us to know. However, as we appreciate its historicity, we can also begin to lean too far into the very literal specifics of the history. And so what this question is really asking is, could we, based on lots of little nuggets, like a detective, figure out the actual day when Jesus died, the actual day of the crucifixion? What some scholars have done over time is they've looked back at historic records, specifically around information like who was the emperor, who was the governor, we know Pilate, who was the high priest, and at what years. All of those bits of information are in the historic record. And so when you begin to remember back in elementary school, we do those logic puzzles? We've got some information across the top and some information down the side, and you can like X out the boxes until you can figure out like what box is most likely. If you sort of do all of that with all of that information, it is true that there is a very plausible way to reduce all of those details down to two specific dates. And one is April 7th in the year 30, and the other is April 3rd in the year 33. Now, before we get too hyper about all that, I don't think this is necessary. And I also think that although you can use some specific information to get to those two dates, you can also argue with other specific historic information that no dates actually work completely. Okay, so there's that. But given that we can use some of the high-level bits of information to narrow it down to one of those two dates, and we can kind of argue that it is most likely that it was, or I could say more plausible, that it's the year 33, not the year 30, that makes it April 3rd of 33. So then why not celebrate Easter on April 3rd every year? Because that's the actual date. Why continue to tie it to the Jewish calendar? And I would say the answer is multi-layered. One being that, theologically speaking, Jesus' death is so intrinsically tied to the idea of Passover that separating the two is really not ideal. Now, granted, we as Christians don't celebrate Passover explicitly, but I bet we would if Easter were not tied to Passover. I mean, the reason we don't celebrate Passover is because we celebrate Easter. So it's the same date. But if we were to say separate this out and make Easter, the crucifixion on April 3rd, and then Easter on April 5th, basically, then Passover would stand alone somewhere else, and we'd be left with this weird moment where we had to celebrate Passover, had to is not quite the right word, where we would likely celebrate the Feast of Passover detached from the theological reality of Jesus' death and resurrection. That doesn't really make any sense. And so I think theologically speaking, keeping those two things aligned matters. We also find that there are many ripples around keeping Passover and Easter tied together, which includes Pentecost. Pentecost is an actual day. So when the Holy Spirit comes and fills the disciples with the capacity to go spread the gospel story, everyone is together in Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost. That was not first a Christian holiday. That was a Jewish holiday. And so if we actually seek to tell the story of both the Passion, Crucifixion, Resurrection, and then Pentecost, which we call the birthday of the church, We could get very wonky with our calendar if we move Easter to April 3rd and we let Pentecost float around to whatever the Jewish holiday is. So for those reasons and some others, keeping Easter aligned with Passover makes good theological sense. It gives us 40 days of Lent, 50 days of Easter, keeps things structured. Now, as a person who works in a church, it sure would be nice to know that Easter was the same date every year. That would make things convenient. We can predict Easter, but it would feel a little bit more rhythmic throughout the spring. I mean, we know sometimes we say Easter is really early this year, or Easter is really late this year. Then sometimes the grand tragedy of our modern condition is when spring break is Holy Week. And then nobody's here for anything. So it can get messed up if we don't have a clear date, but I do think it's probably the best thing to do. So any questions about that? Finding dates and historicity and all of those good things before we jump in?
Easter
Yes.
next year is April 20th.
It is April 20th because my birthday is Palm Sunday. Happy birthday to me. Okay. Yes. I'm sorry.
What was the Jewish holiday that was Pentecost before?
Pentecost.
Well, they didn't wait for the
Yeah.
Holy Spirit.
So it's 50 days after Passover is really, so Penta, 50, is really, they called it multiple different names, but Pentecost is a perfectly appropriate Greek name for the Jewish holiday. And so we just made it something different because it was a feast day after Passover. It was often tied to the harvest. And so there's sort of the end of spring harvest prior to the summer. It's all very seasonal, the way that things work. And so Pentecost is not the wrong name to use for the Jewish holiday. It was called other things too. But then it became something different for Christians because of the Holy Spirit coming and filling up the disciples. But when we read that story in Acts, and the Spirit comes and fills the apostles, disciples, and they go out and they start preaching, and everyone can hear them in their own language. The reason there were so many people in Jerusalem speaking all the different languages is because it's a major pilgrimage day for the Jewish people. So you had Jews coming from all over the empire who all spoke different languages coming to the temple, the same way they would come to the temple at Passover, the same way they would come to the temple at Yom Kippur. Pentecost was one of those big Jewish holidays. And so when the disciples left the room and started preaching in all the different languages, that only makes sense because it was already a big Jewish feast day. So people were coming from all over. Because if it wasn't a major feast day for the Jews, you would have essentially had all the streets filled with people who spoke Aramaic or Hebrew. And so you wouldn't have had perhaps the impact or the power of being able to spread the good news to all the different languages all at the same moment. That kind of make sense? Okay. Other thoughts? All right, then, let's jump in. Today we're going to be focusing on chapter 19, but we do need to finish the very end of chapter 18. So we're going to combine the end of 18 and the beginning of 19 so that we speak of Jesus' trial, and then his crucifixion, and then his burial. Those are the three parts of today's lesson. It sounds really big, but it's basically one chapter because John's story is really not as pastoral as the Synoptic Gospels. If you read the Synoptic Gospels, there's a whole lot more, I hate to put it this way, but there's a whole lot more emotion in the Synoptic Gospels. It is a passionate story. You've got weeping and you've got falling and you've got all kinds of details moving around. John is much more the theologian. He basically says, Jesus was tried, Jesus was flogged, Jesus was crucified, Jesus died. It's very simplified in its drama. And so we're going to see that as we go through today's lesson. So let's start with the trial, and we're going to begin by considering Pilate. Pilate is an important character for us when it comes to the way that John tells his story. So Pilate was the governor of Judea. If you can imagine, the Roman Empire was very large at this point in time. This is not quite the height of the empire, but it's really close. So the Roman Empire has spread all over the place, and every little section of the empire is divided up into smaller states, and there are governors of those states, and the governors work on behalf of the emperor to keep the peace. So if we remember Pax Romana, we have this idea of the Roman Empire kept peace. Now they did that through force, but that peace allowed very crucially for trade to continue and communication as well, but really it's about the economic health of the empire. And so if you can think of the Mediterranean Sea as essentially like a big backwards letter C, a real short one, if you think of the little hook over here in the letter C, you get all of those little Middle Eastern Mediterranean states. You kind of have Turkey up here, then you get down into Lebanon, and then what is today Israel, and then you kind of hook around into Egypt. If you think of that little curve, that was a very important land bridge, so to speak, between the big area of Africa and the big area of Europe. Europe and Africa were the major anchors of the Roman Empire. If you remember back 2,000 years ago, North Africa was extremely important to the health of the Roman Empire. We think Rome, and you might only think of Italy and Europe, but half the Roman Empire was Northern Africa. And so that was very critical to Rome. And as you get into the Middle East, and what we think of today as like Saudi Arabia, the Sinai Peninsula, Iraq, and some of those other countries, they're very arid. It was much harder for people to travel through a desert than it was for them to travel near water. And so Israel's this skinny little area that allows for trade to go by land from Africa to Europe and back. And so Judea itself was not really important for any other reason except that it provided a path between Africa and Europe. It was important for the Roman governor of Judea to simply keep things rolling. It didn't need to be good. It didn't need to be profitable. People who lived there did not need to be healthy or happy. They just needed to be chill. They needed to just let the merchants do their job. And so into this moment comes Pilate, who's a relatively new governor of Judea, and a young person rising the ranks. So a person like Pilate is a politician, and would have wished to get a promotion to go to one of the nice states in the Roman Empire. This is sort of like being posted in northern Alaska before you get a good job. It's like you kind of have to do your time in one of the places where no one really wants to be. I'm sorry if you're from Alaska. But as a Floridian, it makes no sense to me. So there you go. If you go out to Judea, Pilate would have just been counting the days until he got called up and promoted to one of the nice places. And so Pilate is just going through the motions. Pilate is in Jerusalem because it is the Passover feast. And so the majority of the people in his state are Jewish. That makes Jerusalem really important. And even though he certainly would not have enjoyed his time in Jerusalem, he would have to show up every once in a while to wave and wear the Roman things and wave the banners and all that sort of stuff, just to make sure they knew who was in charge. He would have lived on the coast. So we may have mentioned this before, but if you can think of the Israeli geography, in the northern part of the country, it's quite pretty. It is very much kind of lush like the southeast US, very green, very wet, and it can grow a lot of good stuff. Haifa is the city in the northern part of Israel, and just south of Haifa is the Roman town of Caesarea Maritima. It was like a tiny little Rome. That's where Pilate would have actually lived. And when he had to, he would have taken the trip down to Jerusalem and stayed for a few days to wave at everybody and remind them that he could kill them. And then he would go back to the coast where everything was pretty. Okay? All right. Questions about Pilate and Rome and the way that all of that worked. Because for John in particular, more so than the other three Gospels, John really lifts up the political reality of the Jewish people and the Roman Empire. And so to understand the way that they related and the kind of tension that they held is important. So any questions? All right. Let's look at chapter 18, verse 28. I'm going to read some decent chunks of this because kind of like Jesus' birth story, it's easy for us to conflate the different Gospels. And so what I really want us to do, especially today, is focus on what is in John's gospel and what is not in John's gospel. So as we read through this, it would be as if I were to say, tell me the story of Jesus' trial and crucifixion. All of us would be able to tell some version of that story. And all of us would, including me, because I can't do this off the top of my head, all of us would conflate details from all the Gospels because we've lived with it for so long and it has become such a part of the story that we know that differentiating one Gospel from another gets quite difficult. And so as we go through these chunky bits of the end of chapter 18 and 19, make mental notes to yourself of what you're not hearing that you expect would be in that story, because that helps us to differentiate John from the other Gospels. Okay, chapter 18, verse 28. They took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews replied, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." And this was to fulfill what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" And Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So, you are a king?" And Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" Now after he said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no case against him, but you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" And they shouted in reply, "Not this man, but Barabbas." And Barabbas was a bandit. And we'll stop there. Essentially what we are seeing in this passage is kind of a mockery of a trial. This is really not what we would think of as anything fair. And I should say, the idea that Jesus would spend this much time with Pilate in a conversation is highly unlikely. Pilate, as the governor, can just go off and kill whoever he wants. I mean, Rome is, at this point in time, Rome is sort of just, can kind of kill willy-nilly. With the exception that perhaps not like the high priests. I mean, there is a point at which there could be a rebellion of people, but by and large, if a person is below the sort of first tier of the Jewish people, then they're not going to really cause a rebellion. And so Pilate wringing his hands over Jesus is probably not terribly realistic, but for John, he wants to emphasize the real political dance that is happening here. Because essentially you've got the leaders of the power of the world, that's Rome. And then you're going to have the leaders of the religion of the world, and that's the Jewish people. And you're going to have the Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders conflicting over what to do with Jesus. That really does elevate Jesus's reality. So Jesus's presence, his purpose, is meant to be well beyond just religious. Jesus is, as we said many years ago, prophet, priest, and king. Jesus fulfills this tripartite understanding of the Messiah in a way that really had not been filled out before this moment. And so if you think prophet, priest, and king, then it's necessary for all of the powers of the world to come together to make sure that Jesus is killed and essentially by everyone. So nobody's really left out of this. And so it's important to see this dance back and forth between what would be the religious and the political leaders of the day. So Pilate's kind of stuck in a hard place because Pilate, the way John tells the story, sees no reason to kill this person. I mean, killing him is not a huge deal, but in a sense, Pilate doesn't want to just be brutal without any reason, and Pilate sees no reason. And so he's trying to push Jesus back on the Jews, saying, This is some random rabbi who teaches a few dozen people out in the middle of nowhere. I don't have time for this. Like, this is not my issue. This is your issue. And so the Jews multiple times say, we cannot kill him because maybe it's a religious reason, maybe it's a legal reason, maybe it's a timing reason for the festival, and on and on. But the Jews keep saying, no, you have to do it. And Pilate keeps saying, I don't see anything wrong with him. You have to do it. And it's a back and forth and back and forth. Ultimately, Pilate says, okay, how about we do this? I'm only going to kill one person today. So who should I kill? Should I kill this guy or should I kill someone else? And the people yell back, no, release for us Barabbas. Now, we in our scripture tend to make Barabbas out to be someone simple. Like, he's a bandit or he's a murderer. Different gospels use a different word. It sounds to us, at a very cursory reading, that Barabbas is just a criminal. It's not who he was. Barabbas was a revolutionary. Barabbas was a rebel. And so it is important for us to understand that concept, because Barabbas was in prison, and Barabbas could have been put on trial and killed because he was a rebel, and a rebel against all of the people, like against Rome and against the Jewish leaders who were complicit with Rome. So there was an entire branch of Jewish people who felt like it was their responsibility to fight not only Rome, but the Jewish leaders who were complicit in Rome's authority. And so those would be the Jewish leaders like the high priests who were living very high on the hog because they allowed Rome to sort of do whatever Rome wanted, and then Rome rewarded them for their silence. So Barabbas represents this entire group of rebellious Jews that wanted all of them to be replaced, kick all of them out. And so the idea that the Jewish people would wish for him, the idea that the Jewish leaders would wish for him to be set free instead of Jesus says many things, but at least it says that their fear of Jesus and what Jesus could do for the hearts and minds of the people was greater than their fear of what Barabbas might do with the sword. And that's quite important. I saw a hand back there.
So this third group, would you refer to them, would you use the term zealot?
Yes, great question. So this third group of Jews, would they be the zealots? Historically, that's the easy term for the rebellious Jews. They were sort of the ones who were, I don't know exactly how to put this, because any word I use is going to be sort of misconstrued based on the way we use words today. But to keep it simple, these were Jews who thought that the Jewish people should be separate from the worldly powers. That's really simplified, and anyone who studied this for a while can say that's not exactly true, but it's close. It's like 80% of true, because the zealots really, some of them fought for different purposes, but they all wished for the current power structure of the day to be different. They wanted their leaders to not work with the Romans, because the Romans were the oppressors. And so the Jews should, because of their call by God, resist the Romans all the time. And so for the high priests who kind of struck a nice balance with the Romans, like, you give us our stuff, we give you that stuff, we sort of just turn the other way and we ignore what you're doing, that was not satisfying for the zealots. They really wanted the Jewish people to rise up. And remember, just 150 years before this, we get the rebellion, the Maccabean rebellion, that reclaimed the temple. And so it's not as if rebellion was centuries and centuries old. There are people who were being raised at this time who'd been told stories by their grandfather's grandfather about having done just that. So it's not that far in the past.
So this is the first time I've ever heard him not referred to as a robber. And so when you call him a revolutionary, then it seems to highlight the shift in the responsibility to the Jewish leaders, in my perspective, versus him just being a criminal. now all of a sudden becomes political, and they become a little more accountable just by that one word.
Good. So I think that's exactly right. I think John is trying to get us to understand exactly what you just said. This is genuinely a political battle. This moment is really not religious. This is really about the political reality and who has authority and who can maintain their authority. I mean, not to get too far off into the weeds, and apologies, but hopefully this is equally critical to everyone's political leanings. It's sort of like how I would argue that we should absolutely have term limits for all Congress people. Because regardless of where you fall in the political spectrum, if a person begins to preference their own role over doing whatever they think they should be doing, whether I agree with what they think they should be doing or not, if their first order of business is to make sure they keep their seat, well, then really nothing's going to happen. Nothing good's going to happen. And so in a sense, that's what we see right here, is that the Jewish leaders in this moment kind of show us their cards in a sense. They're not really concerned about Judaism. They're really concerned about keeping their job. And that's exactly what John wants us to see. So that is not meant to be hidden.
Is it explained differently by other writers?
By other gospels?
Yeah, or like where are you getting the idea that it was not a robber?
Oh, great. So where do we have the evidence that Barabbas wasn't just a common criminal? So there are other historians that write about this moment, which is one of the reasons that we know Jesus actually lived. So Jesus' trial and crucifixion is recorded in multiple other secular historians. And so if you're interested in that, the easiest one to find is Josephus. And so if you go off and Google Josephus first century history, you can actually read, he was a Jew, actually, I won't even say that. He was a historian, basically, who recorded lots of different details. And he does speak of Jesus. And so he has no religious reason to care about Jesus. But he's writing a bit after this. And so he, as a historian, has a perspective on the impact of Jesus such that he found Jesus significant enough to include in his history. And he's not the only one. And so, but he is the one who wrote in the first century. There are other historians that write around the first century. And so although I think it's good to take their histories and allow them to inform some historic idea, the first century historian should be kind of the primary source. That's our number one. And so if you go off and read some of that, there are ways to fill out the people in this scene that are outside the Bible. And so that's where we get this. And if you have a study Bible, it likely says something to that effect somewhere in the footnotes or the endnotes. So you can check that out later. But yes, Barabbas is a bit more than just a common criminal.
In N.T. Wright's book, he talks about verse 36, and that some interpretations which you seem to say, well, my kingdom is not of this world, as opposed to from this world. He made a big deal out of that. You make a big deal out of that.
Meh. N.T. Wright, who does the commentary that some of you may be reading along with us, is much more of a theologian than I am. And so he picks up, there are multiple ideas that he picks up and develops that I don't even find necessary to mention, because I really like Bishop Wright. I do. And obviously I use him this way. He also has, over the years, made it very clear that he has a particular perspective within the world that he would like to support and expand. That I do not always think is most helpful. And so some of those conclusions that he draws, I think are it gets away from what's actually there, and it gets a little bit more to the stuff I know he would like to be there. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's a bit more commentary. And I think for us, my hope is that we stick as closely to just what is and is not there. And then you guys can go and begin to draw conclusions about how that impacts decisions you make and priorities you set. That's for you to go off and do. And I would rather stay out of that. I don't stay out of it all the time, but I'd rather stay out of it when I feel responsible. I stay out of it. So there you go. All right, that is convenient, isn't it? Okay. All right, so let's keep going, and let's go right into the beginning of chapter 19. Look at chapter 19, verse 4, and we'll kind of continue this idea. Pilate has had Jesus flogged. He's been mocked with the robe and that sort of stuff. So we get to chapter 19, verse 4. Pilate went out again and said to the Jews, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God." Now the Jews are getting a little politically serious. So up to this point, Pilate has kind of been like, you want him dead, you do it. I don't want to do your dirty work. Now the Jews are starting to say some stuff that Pilate hears as having a double meaning. So look at verse 8. Now when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. And Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you?" And Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, here's the kicker, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of the preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the Jews, "Here is your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." Then he handed them over to be crucified. This is hard. And it's quite damning to the Jews. This is not a simple storyline where Pilate and the Jews kind of came together and crucified Jesus. As I noted last week, John's gospel, separately from the synoptics, really pin Jesus' death on the Jewish leaders. And that's a care that we should take when reading through John's gospel, because over the centuries, it's John's gospel that has been used to create many anti-Semitic policies. Because John, in an attempt to focus on the theological and the religious ramifications of Jesus' death, has, I think, accidentally treated Pilate as if it's no longer Pilate's responsibility. Pilate did the best he could. I mean, John does this again and again and again. Pilate tries multiple times to keep Jesus from being killed. And it's the Jewish people that go so far as to say, if you release this man, you're no friend of the emperor. Now remember what Pilate's ultimate goal is. He wants a promotion. And so he does not want anyone writing anything to the emperor, saying anything about how he did not take care of a person who claimed authority like the emperor. So there's that. Then, as if John wishes to twist the knife even harder, when he says to the chief priests, "Should I crucify your king?" they say, "We have no king but the emperor." Whew. That line alone is so wicked, based on everything that we know of the Jewish identity, what God has done over time, God's resistance. Remember way back from Moses to David, God's resistance for a king at all. And the people saying, we still want one, we still want one. And God finally saying, okay, we'll give you a king. And then all of that devolved into the exile. And then they reset. And the Jewish people try to create all these boundaries around themselves so that they would not end up in exile again. And here they are being threatened by Jesus. And what they say is, we have no king but the emperor. Not only their own king that God didn't wish them to have, because God is king. But now they're saying this Roman Gentile is their king, not God. It's very hard. And it's very clear that the Jews in John's gospel are the ones most culpable for Jesus' death. We should be quite clear about the way that John tells this story, because it will help us be more clear moving forward how people can misuse this gospel. Because whatever John meant to write here, it is theologically immature for us to somehow put Jesus' death on the Jewish people. That's not his purpose. That's not what his saving intention has been from the very beginning. From the moment that Jesus is there at the well with the woman in Samaria, his mission is for everyone. Everybody is in. He wants everyone to come into God's embrace. And when he dies for everyone. And so for us to somehow take a few verses and to misuse them in order to blame Jewish people for Jesus' death, we have missed the forest for the trees. Because the big macro purpose of salvation writ large is for every person. And everyone is represented and is, in a sense, culpable for turning their back from Jesus. All right, any questions about that?
Why, in your opinion, are the Jews only blamed for this throughout history thereafter, when indeed the Romans gave judgment and actually physically treated them?
So why are the Jews blamed when the Romans are the ones who actually did the crucifying? Because the people who were in charge when all of these things were growing over the centuries were the Romans. And it's hard to own the responsibility of doing something that you think is wrong. Think how counterintuitive it would be for the Roman Empire so we all know the problem of Constantine comes when he legalizes Christianity. And then shortly thereafter, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And it's all for political reasons. And I mean, it's 98% political. So when that happens, Rome begins to organize all of its theology around Jesus, and that's when we get all of the councils, Council of Nicaea and all blah, 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 blah. We get all of the boundaries put around who Jesus was, because we're human and we want to know who was he and what are we supposed to do now and what can we do? Like, what can I get away with and what can I not get away with? I mean, it's that sort of stuff. And so it would be counterintuitive for a group of people to say, we are responsible for the Savior's death. And so because of that responsibility, we then live in a particular way. That is a vulnerability. That's a weakness. And we should, as Americans, we should know very well how we don't do vulnerability and weakness. We do everything possible, including blatantly lying to ourselves about how strong we are, in order to resist what is very difficult, and that is to actually claim and own responsibility. We don't do that now, and so they didn't do it back then. They're no different than us. They're still just fallible humans. And so that's the way they tell the story. And the Jews were not in authority in the Roman Empire. And so it sure is convenient to have a scapegoat so that we can think very well of ourselves and think very badly on them. That never happens today, does it? Okay. Let's look at the crucifixion. Any other thoughts or questions? The rest of this is actually easier theologically. Yes?
There's one question that's related to the,
Ask it.
okay. Is the episcopal
Transubstantiation.
Sorry.
Yes.
What is the Episcopal review on that compared to the Catholic view on it?
That is a very good question. Can you save that for next week? Because that was probably from a couple chapters ago. And I'm happy to talk about that. Let's save it for next week. Thank you. Okay, let's talk about the crucifixion. So now, as we get to John's version of the crucifixion, it is very different. As I said 30 minutes ago, it's very different than what we see in the Synoptics. In the Synoptics, we get the falling, and we get the wiping of his face, and we get the women weeping, and we get Simon of Cyrene, and all this sort of stuff. In John's Gospel, it is super tight and short. Let's just look at it, and then we're going to talk about the physicalities of what is happening here. So if you look at chapter 19, verse 16b, they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him two others, one on either side, with Jesus between them. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Then the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but this man said, 'I am King of the Jews.'" And Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." This story is, again, explicitly political. So not only do we get, in essentially a part of a sentence, Jesus went out and was crucified. I mean, that's kind of all John says. We get that little nod to crucified with two others, but we get none of the story of you're going to be with me in heaven. None of that stuff is in there. And then we get the political ramifications of Jesus, of the sign above Jesus' head. So in the other Gospels, we get the sign above Jesus' head that says King of the Jews. But that's all it is. Here in John, not only do we get the sign, but we get it told that Pilate wrote it in Hebrew and Latin and in Greek. Essentially what that means for us is if we were to write a sign in today's world in English and Spanish and Arabic and Mandarin, basically, that kind of means everybody in the world can read that sign. That's what it means to write it in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. It's not because Pilate was trying to show off being multilingual. It's because in the Roman Empire, everyone could read, everyone knew Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Most people couldn't read, but everyone at least knew those languages. And so if someone said, "What does that say?" and they read it in their language, they would understand what the sign said. For John, it's critical that it's not about the sign itself. It's about how the sign can be understood by everyone. And so then we get back to what we have heard John say throughout his entire gospel. When Jesus is lifted up, everyone comes into his embrace. And so John has said that version of that statement multiple times. And so here we get Jesus lifted up, and we have in multiple different ways, John says everyone comes within his embrace. Everyone comes within the moment. Within the power of that moment, everyone is included. And that we get through that sign in all three of the languages throughout the empire. Let's talk about the physicality of this. I did draw. So those of you online, you may not be able to see the bottom of this, but don't worry about the bottom because the top is most important. So if we think of the old city of Jerusalem, we might think of the old city of Jerusalem as being sort of a square. If anyone has been to Jerusalem, looked at a map today, the old city is essentially a square. At the time that Jesus was alive, it looks a bit more like a reverse L. So the wall, the temple would have been here on the Temple Mount. Essentially, there's nothing north of the temple in the city. Today there is. But north of the city, we get some of the pools and the cisterns. So like the pool where Jesus would have healed the paralytic, that's up here. Then you get this arch palace. That's where his trial would have been. Pilate would have come there because the people would not have come inside. They would have essentially met kind of in the middle here. And then after Jesus' trial, he would have walked through the city and out the gates of the city into what was a rock quarry. And so outside the city is where people would have been hewing rock in order to continue to build and construct things inside the city. Today, all of this area is included in the walls of the old city, but those walls would not be built for hundreds of years. Those walls would be built by essentially the Muslim empires that took over Jerusalem. And so when they say, some people get confused when they go to Jerusalem today and they go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is built over the site of the crucifixion and the burial, but it's inside the city. When we get to this point in John and they say, took him outside the city, people say, this must not be the right place. It is, because it was outside the city 2,000 years ago. And then when we go about and write about things like the rock that the builders rejected, one of the cool things you can see under the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is where he was crucified, is the actual wall of rock that was not hewn for construction because it was cracked. And so what would happen in a rock quarry is the people would essentially take chunks of rock and create almost little mazes through the rock. They would leave the bad rock, they would cut out the good rock, and so it almost looks like, it's not really looks like a maze, but you would get these little outcroppings of rock that would be at or above the height of a person, because that rock would not be good for building, and they would have just worked around it over time. Many people think, we don't really know, but many people think that he would have been crucified on top of one of those rejected bits of rock in order to have been elevated high enough for the people standing on the ground to see him. Because remember what a crucifixion was. A crucifixion was terrorism. Rome crucified people not because it was the most efficient way to kill them, but it was the best way to scare everyone else into submission. And so it does no one any good to crucify a person where the others cannot see it. And so the idea of elevating the crosses so that everyone had to see a person suffer for hours and hours, sometimes days, before they would actually die, was exactly the point of a crucifixion. Because then if you were thinking about fighting against Rome, you would probably think twice after seeing the horror of what death actually looks like under the hand of Rome. Any questions about the physicality of this? Yes?
Not about that, but when you were talking about the custom of the Roman governor releasing the prisoner during Passover, do you have any historical or archaeological evidence of this particular custom?
Historic evidence of the custom of releasing someone at the Passover? I actually don't know the answer to that for sure. I kind of want to say yes, but I can't think of where it is. So I'll add that and let you all know if there is actual historic evidence for that. Yes?
What is Calvary?
This is Calvary. So that's what this is. So we say Golgotha, Calvary, it's all the same. Right, so it's a rock, not a hill. That's a great question, because if you were to go to, what we are going to get to is Jesus' burial. And Jesus is buried in a hill, in the tomb, that sort of, it sounds very lovely. It's like a hobbit hole. I mean, it sort of sounds like you've got grass and whatever. For a long time, the romantic image of a grassy hill with a pretty round rock and a hole and all that sort of stuff kind of captured artists. And so you would see that artist rendering many times. Well, when archaeologists went back to this area and they found the place that people had spent a millennia thinking Jesus had been crucified and buried, it didn't look to them the way they thought it should look. And so if you were to go to Jerusalem today, there is a second tomb site, and it's called the Garden Tomb. And if you have gone to Jerusalem with Protestants, no offense, but if you've gone like with your Methodist friend or something like that on a Methodist trip or the like, they almost certainly took you to the Garden Tomb. The garden tomb is beautiful. It's lovely. It's pastoral. It's got this little hill, and you can kind of walk in, and it's got a thing, and it's lovely, and you can like light a candle, and you can say your prayer. It's beautiful. If you go to the church in the city walls, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it used to be much darker and dirtier. They've since cleaned it and made it look way better than it did the first time I went. But it's a church, and the tomb looks like this little house in the middle of this huge dome room. I mean, they've essentially taken everything away, and it doesn't feel so good. You know, it feels like it's not probably the right place. And then feelings get in the way. And then you have a lovely person, like in the late 18th century or early 19th century, I can't remember, who was walking around and saw some hill outside the city and thought, that looks much more like where Jesus would have been buried. And so that's what the garden tomb is. And so I'm sorry if you went with your friend and it wasn't with a liturgical church and they took you there and you never saw the other one. You saw a very nice looking hill, but it is not where Jesus was buried. And it doesn't matter. You saw something and you prayed and it was great. But where Jesus was actually buried is not the kind of sexy place that we have in our head. That lovely hill, like you might be playing golf in Ireland or something like that. Like that's not what this is. Nothing really looked like that there. It was stone. It was dusty and sandy, and it really wasn't that kind of place. And so this would have been mostly utilitarian. So an abandoned rock quarry, where they've essentially taken all the rock that they need, is then repurposed for things like burials. And so this would have been where many tombs would have been hewn, because the rock would not have been good enough for building a building. But could you have hewn out a little cave for a burial? Totally. And so essentially, once all the building materials have been taken out, whatever's left over can be repurposed for something else, like tombs. And so when we get to the burial, the idea that the tomb was close by makes total sense, because the quarry would have then been made into tombs, because you couldn't have used any of the rock that remained, because it just wasn't strong enough to create building materials. Yes.
Chris, we know that Jesus was subject to a severe flogging as soon as he was sentenced, which probably shortened his death on the cross. But do we have any estimates of how long he actually remained on the cross before he died?
So the question is, how long would Jesus have been on the cross before he died? It depends on the gospel. And so John's gospel tends to make everything tight in 3-hour bits. So every 3 hours something happens. It is not, it's almost certainly a narrative technique that John is using. We don't get that same sort of standardization in the other gospels. We do, however, get that Jesus' bones were not broken. So when we get to the actual death, and I didn't even pull this out, we know that it can take a long time for people to die when they are crucified, because essentially people die of suffocation. So if you've never studied crucifixion, first off, nails are not put through the hands, because the nails would rip through the hand. It would not hold a body. So the nails are actually put into the wrists, because then the wrist actually holds the body up. As a person is able to hold themselves up, they're able to keep breathing. They're not really losing a ton of blood. And obviously you can go for a long time without food, not so long without water, but a few days, sure. But what ends up happening is that as the muscles weaken, the shoulders collapse, and it essentially puts too much pressure on the lungs to where you can no longer breathe. And so people suffocate, is really how people die at crucifixion, which is why what we won't get to today is that the people crucified with Jesus are still alive, and so their legs are broken. Their legs aren't broken because somehow you'll die of broken legs. The legs were broken because they were continuing to push themselves up with their legs, and once their legs were broken, their lungs collapsed and they suffocated, and that's how they died. Jesus, though, is said to have died without having his legs broken, and I think you could draw any number of conclusions. Could the flogging have cut him so deeply that he actually lost enough blood to where he may have died not of asphyxiation, but he may have died of blood loss. He could have had a cardiac event because he just lost enough blood and all of that sort of stuff. We don't know. But we do know based on the story that when he was buried, his body was still whole, that his legs had not been broken. We will get to the burial next week. It's not overly complicated, and it actually might be kind of nice to have a little of the burial before we get to the resurrection. 2 weeks left. We've got resurrection and then resurrection appearances for our last 2 weeks. And so this will mostly be the last of the sad days. I'll see you all next week. Bye.